reading a couple interesting articles today through the Substack feed, and not the best way to start the day reading about the technocratic advancements in places such as Australia and New Zealand and the test bed, the experiment ground that those two nations, specifically Australia, has been systematically being corrupted and rotted from the inside out by technocratic agendas and the climate agenda, and everything that's being pushed through these wonderful titles of resilience and rebuilding and disaster preparedness, and the extreme modeling that they use to push these ridiculous parasitic and predatory agendas. And of course the government fops and idiots and morons fall for every trick in the book, right? They're the stupidest of the stupid in the bureaucracy. And that's why they're in those positions in the first place, because they're useful idiots. And, you know, the encroachment of all these policies and the ideas that they're pushing through into the culture slowly over the years, you know, accelerated aggressively through the COVID fraud. And, you know, the underlying climate fraud that's been persistent throughout the last couple of decades and more. And now a lot of things are just expediting and being cleverly packaged anew with modernized language and utility of AI and other ways to brainwash and mind control the population on these completely false narratives and completely non-existent disaster issues. But because the media and the populace gets inundated with fake imagery and fake emergencies and fake catastrophes and fake science from these extreme models that cherry pick information that suits their agenda and suits their narrative, how would you know any better unless you're taking the time to look into these things and to try and discern what's true and real as opposed to what's propaganda and fear-mongering and complete and utter horseshit. And then on my hike, I was listening to Badlands Media. I think it's episode 104 with Matt Ehret, and his wife was actually part of it in this particular episode, and putting forth her presentation regarding Iran and the history of everything that's gone down in the Middle East over the last century. And it's quite brutal because most people aren't aware of a lot of these things. Even some of the, one of the hosts was unaware of certain particulars. But once you start digging into some of these things, you realize that it's all connected, and it's that zero-sum game that the Western Empire, particularly through the United States, initially the UK, but that transferred over to the United States early on in the 20th century. And they continued this empire-building rampage that has just left a trail of blood and tears across all of, Asia, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, over the last century, continually funding and arming both sides of every conflict, essentially. Especially in modern times, we hear a lot about Iraq and Iran, Syria, Libya, all these places that have been summarily destroyed by the American military-industrial complex, the intelligence complex, and that arm of Western Empire that continues to just keep their thumb on these countries at every possible turn, keep the boot on their throats, literally, strangling them at every turn. Anytime they try and make some sort of cooperative agreements, anytime they're trying to make some sort of positive momentum to work together amongst these nations, these, outside influences get their fingers into it and again, start fomenting conflict and war. Whatever strings they can pull, whether it's a religious thing, whatever it might be, they'll make sure that they've either gotten rid of and assassinated whoever they need to get out of the way so they can install their particular brutal and corrupted or corruptible dictator or tyrant, whatever you need. Fund and arm both sides, and then find a way for them to self-annihilate, whether it's to stop progress on nuclear power, to stop progress on any sort of trade route, because Iran is in a very geographically particular part of the world that's significant to China and Russia and India and Africa. There's the land bridge there is a pretty important part of the world, so you can see why it's in constant conflict and constantly being destabilized by the powers of the West and the parasites and the predators involved in that game. And this zero-sum game, that they keep perpetuating in the public consciousness, wherein for one society to be successful, strong, and wealthy, the other side has to lose. Somebody has to lose for there to be a winner. And that's, if anything, the American wet dream. the lie that they keep selling to the population and in the West. And I think if the Western audience in Canada, the US, most of the Western type related nations, UK, Canada, United States, Australia, if the public were aware of how much bloodshed was required for them to enjoy their lifestyle, to enjoy their artificially, maintained abundance and prosperity, I don't think they would be able to sleep at night if they knew how many hundreds of millions have been murdered over the last century for the sake of Western empire and the illusion of the sustainability and the abundance and prosperity that we've enjoyed for generations now. The cost that came to people across the pond, the costs that are still to this very day, this minute, this week, people are being killed for the sake of these illusions and delusions of West and the Western Empire. So if you're interested in learning about the truth of these things, I would certainly recommend listening to some of these podcasts or reading some of the offerings by these researchers and analysts who spend an awful lot of time and energy to, as they should, as if real journalists were still in the business of doing such a thing in the mainstream, they would be digging into these things and discerning what is real and true from the noise and the propaganda and the mind control messaging that's out, perpetuated into the public consciousness through the films, the books, the documentaries, and most specifically textbooks that are complete garbage and full of redacted and revised history that have absolutely nothing to do with what is real and true about the history of the West or the East, or about China, Russia, the Middle East, any of that. Never mind the absurdity that is much of modern science and the presuppositions that they carry through and the theories that keep getting taught generation after generation that have never been properly challenged, on and on and on. So it foments and manufactures and manifests this persistent level of stupidity and ignorance in our society, especially in the West. In the East, they've been humbled because they've been so repeatedly beaten down and destroyed. They are by default simplified. They've had to minimize their lives. They live by simpler means. They try and take care of their own needs as best they can because their markets and economies are so volatile based on, one news conference to the next in the West. It's quite something when you hear the locals through an interview with vloggers and YouTubers that go visit Iran in person to see for themselves the beauty and the history and get to talk to some of the locals about what's going on and how things are there, that, one news conference from someone like Donald Trump can sway their entire economy, their entire current value of currency, and everything can change dramatically from day to day based on what idiots in the White House are talking about in any particular moment. And that's astonishing, that level of influence and power. And that can only happen because they're so persistently downtrodden, beaten up, infighting, and stomped on by the Western Empire. And any progress and upward positive movement that they have is squashed as soon as it can be. And the narrative that is maintained in the West is one of, well, we have to beware of, terrorism and all the rest of it, when it is their own actions and their own practices over generations that has generated exactly that particular circumstance, so that they can justify attacking and attacking and attacking based on false narratives, based on false histories that they have very much been a part of creating through the military-industrial complex, intelligence agencies, through all of their maneuvering through politics and banking and the brutal and violent and murderous games that they play. But you'll never hear about, and you'll get little bits and pieces of it, maybe in the odd film here and there, the little truth bombs that might sneak out, but it's mostly framed in such a way that West is good, West are the heroes. If you got the right flag patch on your uniform, you're the good guy, and they're the bad guy, when nothing could be further from the truth. The lies and illusions that they have to perpetually propagandize the servicemen and women of these so-called peacekeeping forces of the world has got to be a daily kind of a ritualistic sort of thing that just inculcates this level of complete ignorance and stupidity, to the point of being an absolute moron to believe that you're a hero, that you're actually going in to flush out the bad guys, and that you're going in to, go after the likes of whatever you want to call it, this rebel faction of the weak that is armed and funded and created by Western Empire. So this zero-sum game is an old one that, most recent times it started in the late 1800s and perpetuated aggressively through the world wars, which was primarily instigated and created by the forces of the UK and their banking interests, and the Churchills and other murderous psychopaths of their time that, made the likes of Hitler out to be the bad guy. And it's complex in that regard, and who did what and why is quite detailed and involved, but it's difficult to find the truth of it in any Western-based texts because we're so heavily propagandized here. And of course, we project the idea that, the people in Russia and China and the Middle East are heavily propagandized. They don't know the truth. They just keep training enemies of the state over there. They don't know how good they could have it if only they could figure out how to get along, when the truth is, anytime they've tried to get along and collaborate and develop trade initiatives and to work together and collaborate in peaceful ways, the West steps in and stomps it out as quickly as possible, and then finds a way to frame it in such a way that they're the bad guys, and we had to do this for the safety of the nation, for the national security. Make up whatever excuse and lie that you want. It's all fiction, but it's convenient fiction, and it's convincing, and when it's held up by state propaganda and Hollywood machine and the news media and the mainstream, you are left completely blind, daft, and dumb to the truth of these things. And it becomes a zero-sum game because you're convinced that you're righteous and you're on the right side of history and the right side of truth, which is complete and utter nonsense. So I think it's important for us on some level to, be informed about these things, but it's such a dark and nasty thing to look into that it's going to ruin your day. And, even reading this article this morning, listening to the podcast, it's easily quite depressing because I care. I don't like to see the pain and suffering and wanton murder and destruction of nations on the other side of the world that is populated by people just like me, people trying to live out a purposeful, meaningful life, trying to raise families, trying to explore ideas of spirituality and entertain the curiosity and mystery that is the human experience. So they have to do that in a very different sort of way, a cloaked, sort of secretive kind of way, because should they show any signs of real improvement, big bad Uncle Sam and his buddies are going to come over and stomp it out, like they have done consistently over the last since World War II, basically. So I would urge anyone who is, prone to believe anything put out, proliferated, propagated by the Western media to think twice, because a vast majority of it is complete fiction. It's state propaganda mixed with intelligence community propaganda mixed with straight up Hollywood storytelling. You're not getting the truth, and if you're never willing to get off your ass and go to one of these countries for yourself to see it in person, to see what's real and true about the Middle East and China and Russia on the ground, in person, you should shut your mouth about these things because you don't know what you're talking about. And to think that you're righteous and that you understand the situation and that you have any sort of semblance of intelligence whatsoever regarding what's real and true about that life, their lives, who the people are, what the culture represents, you're kidding yourself. The point essentially is that the zero-sum game is a farce. It's a lie. It's an obfuscation of how human society actually works and how the world could easily work, whether or not it's capital or market-based. It doesn't have to be predatory. It doesn't have to be violent and separatist, and it doesn't have to be playing these murder games generation after generation. It doesn't have to be pitting societies and countries and nations, which is nothing more than idea and fake lines drawn on a map. It doesn't have to be pitting these sides against each other to keep the costs low for the yachts and the Teslas and the BMWs for the West. It doesn't have to be destroying children's lives generation after generation in Africa so that you can have a cell phone every fucking year. It doesn't have to be destroying anything, anywhere, ever, for the technology that we are being brainwashed and propagandized into believing is necessary for progress, is necessary for us to take the next evolutionary step, that we desperately need AI and more computers and more computing power and smarter systems that can reason better than humans to be able to solve these existential problems that are being created by the exact same system that purports to be solving these issues. All these health issues, psychological issues, spiritual, psychic, economic issues are created by the machine to justify its own existence. All of these problems handed down, all these acts and policies and programs enacted by government are in reaction to the problems they create, that are reactions to the corporate interests that tell them and bribe them and coerce them into promoting in the public consciousness to make non-existent issues existent and real, and emergency situations and disaster relief, and on and on and on. All these dire existential problems that we must deal with as soon as possible. So we need more laws and more litigation, more surveillance, more tech, more digital currencies, more digital IDs, more reasons and ways to push people out of their homes just because their area is prone to disasters based on some sort of exorbitantly ridiculous modeling in some computer that was given only specific information, particular details, so that they can draw their own conclusions for their own needs to push their agendas, to make more profits, to be able to buy up more land, to take more control. And ultimately, it doesn't really make any sense to me. You know, if you want to own the world, to what end? If you want to move people to cities to poison and toxify them and to make them psychopathic, because we're not meant to live clustered and close together in big numbers like that, and to feed them GMO foods and genetically modified this, that, the other thing, to force them to take injections of toxic, poisonous pharmaceutical products. To what end? You'll wipe them out, and then who are your consumers going to be? Who's going to be buying your shit? Who's going to be investing in your products? Who's going to be, supporting the market if you wipe them all out or harm them in such a way that they just don't want to participate anymore? What's your end game there? It's one thing to farm humans and to utilize their energies for these things, but it is a zero-sum game. Ultimately, it's a self-annihilating game. So if you're getting caught up in these ideas, if you're getting in any way convinced that it's a good idea, that we need more tech, more progress, more GMO, more surveillance, we need technology, in the soil, we need smart seeds that are resilient to climate change, don't be such a fucking idiot. You need to wake up and inform yourself that all of these things are complete fiction. They were never necessary because nature provides. Nature gave us the seeds, and everything that's described regarding any sort of scarcity whatsoever is based on fundamental lies. There's no lack. There's no scarcity of anything. And there never will be. That's the most important thing to understand. So the zero-sum game is a lie. No matter where in the world you look at it, no matter what angle you want to look at it from, it doesn't have to be. It's not necessary. And you need to wake up to the fact that if you're buying into any of these narratives and stories being perpetuated about places like Iraq, Iran, Syria, Libya, China, Russia, you are completely misinformed and wildly ignorant about what's really going on in the world. And I would urge you to remedy that situation. Have a good one.
Putting the blame on a brother for shadows you bring of your own. A slap in the face of your mother. Your chances of peace are